Listen to Salam Media.
16 after 9 exactly. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the show. And next on a line, we have Ayesha Kajee. She is a research fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues. We're here to talk about why soldiers have overthrown President Kaboré. Now, hundreds of people in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, have been celebrating after the military seized power on Monday. The ousting of President Kaboré was unsettling but not unexpected, and it is the fourth coup in West Africa in the last 17 months. What on earth is going on in that part of the world? Let's speak with Ayesha Kajee and she can unpack for us. Assalamu alaikum to you, dear sister. Welcome to the show.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me. Yes, it's a region that's been beset by so-called Islamic militants and armed attacks from groups supposedly linked to ISIS and or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. So this area, the Sahel region as a whole, has become ripe for military coups, for takeovers of power, because people have been campaigning against their governments in protest at the armed attacks from militant groups, usually to the north of places such as Mali, Chad, Niger, Guinea-Bissau, etc.
Ayesha, undoubtedly a while ago we were speaking to you about the Sudanese situation and other North African regions. Undoubtedly there seems to be a lot of problems, well, not only in Africa. I mean, you just look at the Ukraine, you look at all over the world, as a matter of fact. Yemen, I mean, I just spoke to Tembisa Fakude a short while ago about the attack of the Houthis on the Emiratis and how that is also going, we're just not sure what the outcome is going to be like. So it seems at this point in time, the whole world is on fire. But coming back to the African continent, there is displacement of hundreds of thousands of people because of all of these wars. And of course, the issue around ISIS or the Islamic extremists. What exactly is now happening as far as that is concerned right across the region? These people are putting their lives totally at risk, trying to flee the supposed war in their own countries, but then walking into other war-torn countries itself.
Yes, that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that borders in the region, across the Sahel region, that's from, Mali to Burkina Faso to Guinea-Bissau to Chad and Niger, are very, very porous borders. They're also very arbitrary borders. So there are strong social ties connecting people who live on either sides of the border. So, if you've got family or good friends across the border and you think your life has become unbearable where you are, it's often a question of deciding to uproot yourself and move, particularly if you've been the victim of attacks by armed groups such as these so-called ISIS and Akim, Al-Qaeda and the Maghreb groups. Now, part of the reason that these attacks are so widespread and frequent is that the local militaries in those countries across the region have been unable to oppose them effectively, have been ill-equipped, if you will, both in terms of numbers of soldiers on the ground as well as military equipment to oppose those armed attacks. And because those attacks have generally been on civilians in far-flung areas, usually civilians who live in very poor circumstances, central governments have been slow to react. And this has caused frustration, anger, tension amongst people. Hence, in Burkina Faso for the past week or so, there have been demonstrations in the streets with people actually asking for a coup, chanting in support of a coup. And since the president was detained, since he's been under house arrest, although we're not told where, he was arrested at a military base together with other top officials, President Kaboré. The military say that he's safe, that he's physically unharmed. However, nobody is saying where he is, so it's still unknown. And ECOWAS did put out a statement yesterday saying that Kaboré had resigned under threats, intimidation and pressure from the military. So the exact situation with regard to the president and other high-ranking officials is still unknown. The situation is different from that in the Sudan, however, where we've had a transitional government that's now been again taken over by the military for very different reasons. So the situation in Mali has largely been in reaction to these armed attacks, in reaction to people being killed, about 2,000 people being killed in the last 6 or 7 years, 50 members of the armed forces being killed in December last year. So there's a lot of anger about this. But there is also, allied to that, a sense of frustration that President Kaboré's government was actually not just doing nothing about that situation in the north, in the areas that have been under attack by insurgents, but also that this government has had no compassion for the people who've suffered, who've been suffering even pre-COVID in economic terms, due to extreme poverty, due to lack of service delivery, etc., but whose suffering has been escalated during the economic downturn that COVID brought over the last 2 years. So there are multiple reasons behind why many civilians are saying this is not really a coup. It is merely a change of government that people wanted. But because it's not through the ballot and rather through the bullet, of course it is in practice a coup, in practical terms a coup. And organizations such as ECOWAS, the African Union, and the UN have condemned it. But also there seems to be in the last few years, as you said, a move towards more coups, and provided that they have a timeline for a transition to civilian authority, for elections, etc., for some type of democratization in theory, even though that may not be democratization in practice, these coups seem to have no real repercussions for the coup plotters and those who actually carry them out.
And sadly, you spoke about COVID and how that's impacted on these countries. I mean, there's so much hardship being endured by the people. The militant attacks that began in 2015 have claimed more than 2,000 lives and have forced 1.5 million people from their homes, something we touched on a little earlier. And this, of course, is according to United Nations estimates. And the very, very sad part about all of this is that schools are closed in obviously large parts of the country because it's just too dangerous for them to open, which means going forward, we're going to have another lost generation of youth.
Absolutely. Illiteracy levels, just to take one indicator, are very, very low in Burkina Faso and neighboring countries. And part of that speaks to this insecurity that schools are closed, people don't go to school, they don't get any kind of improvement in their daily circumstances in terms of an education. It also speaks to the fact that health services are almost non-existent across much of the country. And you mentioned 1.5 million people displaced. Most of those are actually internally displaced, but that's a huge number for a relatively small population of about 20 million. So you're talking literally of 3%, 3 in every 100 people being displaced people. That's an astoundingly horrific statistic to think. You think of any 100 people you know, and you think 3 of them have had to leave their homes, have had to either voluntarily or involuntarily move from their homes, their livelihoods, their families, etc. And you can just imagine the degree of devastation it wreaks, not only now, but as you've pointed out, for generations to come, and leading us essentially, as you've said, into another lost generation, into greater illiteracy, which will mean greater poverty, greater economic hardship, etc.
So let's come back to their neighbors, the neighbors of Burkina Faso, neighboring Mali. They've seen two recent interventions in this time, fueled by concerns over an inability to deal with growing militant Islamist violence, as they put it. So just how serious is this supposed Islamic threat, not only to Mali, but the people in Burkina Faso as well? That's,
as I
that's
said
really
before,
adding
yeah,
to their woes as it is.
it's a regional problem, Julie. The porous borders mean that people can cross borders easily. It also means that there's a proliferation of small arms in the region. You can literally, in some of those countries, I speak of Chad, for example, where I've seen this. In parts of Chad, you can walk into a local market and see arms for sale alongside the fruit and vegetables. I know this sounds amusing, but it's actually not. It's horrifying. There are a lot of cold era weapons still circulating in the region. So it's very easy for armed groups to rise up and to equip themselves fairly quickly. And of course, there are many theories about where they're getting their funding from. But even without massive inputs of funding, they're able to arm themselves and militarize quickly. So to demobilize them, governments in the region are almost hamstrung because those governments themselves are not well equipped. In fact, one of the reasons behind the Burkina Faso coup right now is that, those 50 soldiers or members of legitimate armed forces were killed in December. They were not well equipped. They didn't have the correct equipment to actually oppose the insurgents. And they weren't well trained either in military tactics, etc., which has led to frustrations. In Mali, as you said, 2 failed coup attempts. But of course, in Mali, there's also this divide between the north and the south that has been ongoing for about almost 20 years now. And none of the successive governments in Mali have addressed the issues, have addressed the resentments of the tribes in the north against the people of the south, against the government in the south. And this lack of addressing deep-held grievances over land, over service delivery, over underdevelopment, over things such as education and health services, that's so deeply ingrained now into the fiber of the conflict between the North and South in Mali that really nobody has been able to tackle it for almost, as I said, almost 20 years, 18 years or so. And the danger of the same thing happening in places like Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad is very, very great, given that the so-called Islamist threat from movements that began with Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb but have now morphed into other movements, movements that some say are ISIS-funded or offshoots of ISIS. Again, very little is known about them in reality. A lot of this is theoretical supposition, okay? But we do know that there is an Islamist element. We do know that they are armed, and we do know that funds are being channeled to them, although people disagree on the mechanics of how those funds are channeled. So there is a need as a region for either ECOWAS or ECOWAS in conjunction with some of the former colonial powers, perhaps France, I don't know, to take a stance. I would hate to see more involvement, personally, of France in the region, even though it has brought temporary pieces, because it is really an extension of the colonial empire. And that is something that Africa needs to resist rather than encourage.
And I'm surprised that you bring up that issue, France, having to possibly intervene, because just a week or so ago, Mali, the people of Mali went out into the streets in their hundreds of thousands, protesting against France's involvement in Mali. They want them out. They want them out totally, because they believe they've had way too much of colonial interference in that part of the world.
Absolutely. France comes in under the guise of bringing more stability, brings troops in to kind of shore up existing regimes, but generally regimes which agree with France's own political agenda and diplomatic and geopolitical agenda in the region. And that has been problematic because it brings no real relief, no real long-term development to the people of the region, be they Malians or Burkinabe or Chadians.
Ayesha, whilst I have you here, let me just take advantage of the situation. If you'll just allow me 5 minutes more of your very valuable time. What's happening in the rest of the region of North Africa? Middle and North Africa, obviously, and Sudan in particular. I know that is a country very close to your heart for obvious reasons. I mean, you mentioned some, you did mention that Abdullah Abe is a very personal and close friend of yours. So what's happening there and the rest of that region?
Sudan is still in a state of flux. Yes, Abdullah Hamdok is someone I count as a personal friend,
Pardon,
a former
Hamdok.
referee to me. Yes.
Pardon, Abdullah Hamdok.
No, that's fine. That's fine. The situation on the ground is very, very fluid in Khartoum and Omdurman, its twin city at the moment, from everything I've been able to gauge. People are wary of speaking out right now because there is a level of repression. Control of the media is still in military hands. Control of the internet is still largely in military hands as well. And the people who are speaking are saying that essentially there is a climate of fear currently ringing the capital and its twin city. Further afield, I'm not sure what's going on. There is still a determination to resist military rule, but also a growing, I think, unfortunately, a growing but realistic acceptance of having to work with the military to come to some kind of transition that will be acceptable to Sudanese people, to the forces for democracy in Sudan, the professional associations in Sudan, etc. I know that Sudanese people here in South Africa, I've spoken to a couple of them, are very, very concerned about what's going on back in their homeland. But the reality is that the military might right now, the might of the military and its control of key sectors of the economy is so huge that it's starting to feel like there's no way forward except to come to some arrangement with them that will perhaps grant immunity from prosecution for warlords, as it were, for people responsible for a great deal of terror, murder, loss of life, not only in Darfur over the years, but also since the start of the political transition in Sudan 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now.
That's where we leave it. Thank you indeed for your valuable time and your insights into the African continent, politics in the African continent. Till the next time, as always, stay safe and salaam alaikum to you.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me on the show.
That was Ayesha Kajee. She is a research fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues, talking to us about the situation, the coup in Burkina Faso, why soldiers have overthrown President Kaboré. It is exactly 9:34. News and views on Salam Media. Stay with us. Still lots to unpack on the show this morning.